My name is Diana Levine. I am the Director of Alumni Career Management, and I'm pleased to be here today to moderate our session on board service. For a brief snapshot on me, I've been at the business school for 14 years, working in career services, initially with our full-time MBAs in the fields of private equity, healthcare, and consumer goods. And for the last 3 years, been working with our experienced professionals, our executive MBA and alumni. Before that, I was at NYU Stern in their Career Center for Working Professionals, supporting their part-time MBAs and alumni in a similar capacity. I'm a Duke University undergrad alumni and a University of Michigan Ross alum. I started my career in consulting, worked for a boutique management consulting firm called Maricon Associates that was acquired by Charles Rivers Associates. And post-MBA, I worked in the field of consumer goods, brand management at PepsiCo's Quaker Oats division, Cadbury Schweppes on the Snapple brand team, and finally at Unilever in their home and personal care division on the Axe Shower Gel team before transitioning to career development. But I'm pleased to be here today to moderate today's session, and I'm going to kick it over to my panelists, and I'm going to briefly have them introduce themselves. Maggie, if I could start with you.
Maggie Benkert, Columbia Business School, class of 2016, so this is my 10-year reunion. It's good to be here with you all. I am a member of the CEO and board advisory partners at Russell Reynolds. This is a division of our firm that focuses on both traditional CEO and board recruiting, as well as long-term succession planning and effectiveness advisory for boards. And looking forward to our conversation today.
Leo.
Well, good afternoon, and first of all, it's great to be back on campus, and thanks to Diana and Tom and the whole group that pulls all this together every year. So my name is Leo Espinoza. I'm a partner at Spencer Stuart, based out of Houston. I started my career at, my undergrad was at Colorado State in accounting. I did forensic accounting for a few years, and then I moved into management consulting, and then I've been doing this for the past 19 years. And what is this? This is, I've split my time between board work and between executive search work. On my board work, I do work across industries and geographies, which is great because of all the cross-pollination that needs to take place. And from an executive search standpoint, I do a lot of CEO, COO, CFO, types of searches, CCO, in the industrial sector. And that is vast. So there are 3 main areas that I focus on in that regard. Infrastructure and EPC is one, industrial services is the other, and the third is energy broadly across fossil fuels to renewables, power companies, et cetera. So it is great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. Claudia.
With my former colleague here, Leo, I have been, so I'm with Korn Ferry. We are a human capital consulting firm that does a variety of things, including organizational design consulting, compensation consulting, advisory and development of senior leadership executives, and then we do executive search as well. I sit between board and CEO succession planning at the top, essentially focus on anything having to do with the governance of those practices, the recruitment, and the best practice kind of organizational strategy behind any kind of succession within an organization. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm a generalist by nature, but I do focus a lot of my time in 3 industries, actually 4. One is industrial, consumer, and life sciences, and I do a fair amount in business services. I'm dangerous in financial services and technology, but by no means an expert. So a lot of what I do, in addition to helping with succession planning in the boardroom, and board recruitment, is governance consulting. So I work on large-scale governance projects that might be for pre-IPO organizations or companies that are issuing debt for the first time, international entities that are thinking about listing on the US exchange, as well as I spend a significant amount of my time convening directors. So for the last 10 years, I have a group of nominating governance committee chairs from Fortune 500 companies that I've been convening, and really to stay close on all the trends that are happening in the governance world and really understanding how governance is changing over time. So hopefully I can share some of that wisdom today, and I'm really happy to be part of the group. I also am an alumni of Columbia, but I have my Master's of Science in Library and Information Sciences from the Columbia Graduate School, and I have my undergrad from Fordham University in philosophy.
Great. Hi, I'm Lisa Washburn. I graduated from Columbia Business School in 1999, which was a full decade out of undergrad for me. And I guess I've read in some articles that people tend to have 3 distinct career phases in their lifetime. So my first career was more in the public sector. I worked for the federal government doing arms control negotiations for about 10 years. Then I went to Columbia Business School. I didn't know how to use Excel at that point. Columbia trained me incredibly well. I had a 20-year career at JP Chase in various finance roles, starting in investment banking, then a ton of external reporting, IR work, as well as global debt capital markets business management. And Columbia prepared me so well for that career. And I really enjoyed JP Chase, if anyone wants to talk about JP Morgan. Then I took an early retirement around the time of the pandemic. I had 2 kids, a mom that was getting a little bit ill, et cetera. I figured I'd have more regrets if I didn't take the time. But then during that time, I've got increasingly involved in nonprofit work. And it's really very gratifying to be able to give back some of the skill sets that I've developed over the last, 30-odd years. I'm not that old, though. I just graduated. But it's been really gratifying. I've become increasingly involved at Yale, which is my alma mater, in the library area, the Peabody Museum, as well as a few things in New York City as well, the American Composers Orchestra, and some entities in my town as well, the Mather Homestead, which is a colonial homestead in Darien, Connecticut. So I really welcome the opportunity to chat with you guys and look forward to it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for all of those introductions. Just for some housekeeping rules, I have about 30 minutes of questions prepared, and then we're going to have plenty of time for all of you to get your questions answered because we know that is, some of the most exciting part of this conversation. So formulate those questions as we go. But the first question is going to be for Leo, and it's what are the responsibilities and obligations of serving on a board, and how do they differ for corporate, private advisory, and then we'll ask Lisa to comment on nonprofit specifically.
Sure. So the mandate hasn't changed in terms of what is required and needed of board members. It's still the 3 basic things. It is going to be strategy oversight. It is going to be risk management oversight, actually, and succession. A lot of that CEO succession, but also paying a close eye to, is this a talent academy, and is there an ability to develop talent within this organization? So those things are, the core requirements of any role. Now, what's changed though is the intensity, and also in the past, people have been able to sit on a board and maybe it wasn't as time consuming, but now it's about 200 to 300 hours for a board, so you have to really be engaged. If we look at the data, there are a number of searches or board roles that actually go to the CEO and CFO still, 59% if we look at the S&P 500. But also then what else is there and what has changed? And so those skills and what's required of a board member is going to be now not only having a breadth of governance and business judgment, but it's also going to be having a deep spike in 1 or 2 areas. The one thing we, of course, are hearing of a lot right now is AI, cyber, anything digital. And so bringing that perspective as well to the boardroom in a broad context is critically important. Now, if we talk about the differences, public boards are still very much compliance-driven, more formal. If you look at private equity boards, they're going to be more operationally focused. Capital allocation, it's going to be probably more hands-on than your typical public company board.
Perfect. And Lisa, can we have you differentiate any of the responsibilities and obligations of being on a nonprofit board from your experience?
Sure. Well, strategy, oversight, succession, those are all still relevant, in the nonprofit area. I think it's difficult for nonprofits to stick to their mission to some degree because there's always a need out there in the environment. So sometimes they can try to do sort of too much based on what their funding profile is. That might mean they initiate a capital campaign or something, but I think the board can serve as sort of a tether point, and especially with the other MBA skill set, I feel like our skill set is so valuable in the nonprofit space, whether it's finance and accounting, mission strategy, governance, all of those things are so important for the nonprofit, I think, to keep it in line, in a sense. And in a sense, I think also the nonprofit board member represents the donors as well as the beneficiaries of the organization. So that next donor that you're out there seeking in the world will look for a clear mission, a value add to whatever space they're trying to play in, and also really rigorous controls. We've seen many a nonprofit go asunder for operational controls.
Perfect. Appreciate that insight, comparing and contrasting corporate boards, private boards, and nonprofits. Claudia, if I could address this question to you. How does the size, stage of a company, and market cycle influence a board's mandate?
It doesn't really influence the mandate. I think the way Leo and Lisa spoke about the core responsibilities of the board remain the same. I think in my experience, however, working with a smaller mid-cap company, I find that a lot of the directors that I've placed over the years actually get a lot more fulfillment out of those boards than the larger cap boards, because they have an opportunity not only to be a strategic guide and help with various investor-related capital allocation decisions, risk, et cetera. They also can, the management team tends to be more open for support beyond just what's discussed in the boardroom. They really look to the board as an extension of advisors to help. And I think that when I normally talk to directors who serve on the spectrum of boards you just discussed, they really like the fact that they can see the impact of their contributions at that small and mid-cap level, and of course, even private and family businesses. In terms of the market cycle, for the public companies, the market cycle, I think, is pretty consistent every year. We tend to see a lot of recruitment activity in the fall in preparation of proxy season, which typically the proxy disclosures are required around between February and end of March. So a lot of boards come to us in the fall asking for support. Succession planning is something that's happening more and more, where boards are thinking maybe a year out, 18 months, 2 years, and starting to ask to be introduced to people, or at least be aware of people that might be out there to consider for their boards, and have some kind of meet and greet type of relationship with the board, so that when the need arises, they have a pipeline of people they can consider. But generally, the cycle is very heavy in the fall, and then it gets heavy again after proxy season. So kind of the end of May, June timeframe. This is an unusual year for us because we're seeing a lot of demand this summer. And I think, based on some statistics that we had, 2025 was probably the biggest year of board director transition that's happened in a long time. And so I think there's a lot more opportunity out there for people who are interested in boards. But I think there's a lot of interest in what Leo was saying, which is, boards typically look for the T-shaped director, someone who has the breadth to be able to opine on a lot of things, but some depth in a particular area of interest. So that tends to lend itself less to the functionals types of roles and more to general management, CFO roles, et cetera. So that's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that that functional roles are not interesting. It just means that the demand is higher for those more senior visibility roles because of the perceived impact that they can bring to an organization.
Thank you. Maggie, if I could address this question to you, can you share with the audience what you believe are the benefits and the risk of serving on a board and the associated time commitment?
The benefits most people recognize right off the bat to adding board service and any new career opportunity are going to be the opportunity to both learn and to increase your network. We see with retired executives who are often sitting on boards that it gives them a chance to stay connected to the industry and keep their connections within the industry fresh. But we are also increasingly seeing active executives sitting on boards outside of their day job, and they are also seeing those benefits because Often these are individuals who, by sitting on the other side of the table, are getting a better purview into how their board's thinking about the business, and they can think bigger picture and bring more insight to the role that they're filling on a day-to-day basis. Beyond that, sitting on boards is rewarding. People like that they can have that impact that Claudia was talking about, and it's a chance to have that influence at the highest level. But all of this does not come without risk. I mean, Leo mentioned, this is a fiduciary role. You have a responsibility to the shareholders, and with that comes reputational risk as well as just accountability and liability that comes with that. And so those are important things to consider, and that's why it's so important. These boards are doing a lot of diligence on the people that they're appointing, and it's important that you're doing just as much diligence on any board that you are considering joining. And the final thing I'll mention in terms of the risks is that time commitment. As Leo alluded to, we're looking at 200 to 300 hours a year, and that's sort of standard. Don't look at the board schedule and see 4 board meetings a year and a dinner and say, I can do that. There's the pre-reads, there's the staying educated, and then there's the one-off events that can make that spike. And if you're an active executive, that may happen at the same time things are spiking in your day job. We saw that in 2020 when every company had to react to the pandemic at the same time. We saw board directors trying to figure out where to allocate their time, and that became a big risk for a lot of them.
Perfect. I'm going to start with Claudia on this, but I'd love everyone to chime in if you have additional perspective as well. When you think about what makes an exceptional board member, what are the top attributes of a strong candidate?
Just to build on something Maggie and of course Leo said before, capacity is important because of those kind of one-off issues are a lot more frequent than they have been in the past. Between COVID, now with the geopolitical situation, the activists who are really, really kind of going after companies in a much more significant way, we've seen a bit of a spike in that activity. That 300 hours or whatever it was is spiking to more like 375, 400 hours. And if you're an active executive, really think hard. I have a program where I help C-suite executives as part of their development get onto boards. And the minute I say what the requirement of time is, much of them start to say, oh my God, there's no way I could do my day job and do this job. So really think hard. I placed somebody on as a director on a board who was active, and he just didn't show, he didn't really think that it required that much time, was reading the materials on the plane down to the board meeting. Believe me, every director in that room noticed, and they said to me, we thought he was gonna be great, and he's really underwhelming. So flew up to see him, gave him the feedback, told him what he needed to do to really turn it around, and now he's MVP, but he has invested significantly more time into the effort. So that's just I can't stress that enough, and I think it's really important, since we've all said it, to really bring it to life in a real way. But in terms of what makes an exceptional board meeting member, I think it's shifted a lot from hard skills, like I just said before, around C-suite leadership, et cetera, to competencies. We're in such a world of uncertainty that mindsets, competencies, and behaviors are starting to rule the day. So, the problems and challenges that management teams are dealing with now around innovation, around business models, how tech is going to impact the viability of businesses, et cetera, nobody has the answer to those. There's no previous experience, even though when I get a spec for a board director, a lot of what people want is, I want someone who's been through a transformation. Well, guess what? No one's been through this kind of transformation. So it really comes down to, what do you really need? What you really need are people who are agile, who are curious and continuous learners, who are courageous to really speak up when they start to see things that may matter in the long run, and who really have that integrated thinking ability to connect dots in the moment when you're having those discussions with the board to really make them think. And I think that is so much harder for people like us to measure, but it is something that we think is kind of the true differentiator on what makes a good director versus a great director.
Does anyone else? I'm hearing a lot of dealing with uncertainty, being comfort with ambiguity, being an agile leader. I think one of you mentioned this analogy of being a T person in terms of you have to be able to go broad, but also swim in your lane and have your functional expertise. Does anyone else have anything they would want
I
to
would
add?
just add that independence is critically important. Judgment, having solid judgment, and then that cultural fit. So what does that mean? Having courage. You need to be able to speak up and challenge, but do it in a manner that it doesn't disrupt the culture of the boardroom. Having that ability to really speak up and have that courage, but not disrupt a good relationship is also important.
And we moved quickly over the skill sets and the sort of board matrix portion of what boards are looking for, but it is sort of table stakes critical importance. So I'm mentioning it especially for those of you that may be 5, 10, 15 years out from board service as you think about where your career is headed. These boards, when they come to us, are coming with a specific need within their board. And so you do need to have those behaviors, those competencies, and that ability to contribute in the boardroom. But if you are not fulfilling a need that's relevant to that board, you aren't going to be a candidate for that seat. And so we're always seeing the financial expert for the audit committee. We're always seeing the need for that experienced CEO. And then we need those experts in the topics that are critical to the business, depending on industry or point in time. And so that's something important to keep in mind as well.
Perfect. I want to transition the conversation to trends in board recruitment. Leo, I know you mentioned some trends currently, whether that's cyber, AI. Are there other prevalent trends in board recruitment that you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, so I think the one trend that I mentioned, 59% of board seats are going to CEOs and CFOs. They want that type of experience. You need a QFE, qualified financial expert, to chair audit committee if there's a need for that. So there's a lot of roles that go to folks with those two backgrounds. I would also say these other things like AI right now is critically important. I think every client I have in the industrial sector now has another vertical, and it's focused on mission critical. It's on the data centers. It's the ecosystem around that. And so that's one thing. I think the other thing is just the geopolitical environment. And so being able to think on a global basis, on a broad basis, and be able to chime in on that is also one thing that I'm hearing time and time again. The mandate, as I mentioned earlier, it's not changed from strategy, risk, succession, but the intensity of it, the time that's going to be involved, the engagement that they want is going to be important. And then I think the final thing I would mention is we need people that are interested in boards, but it's not about that. It is a specific bespoke spec that Maggie was speaking to. So what does that board composition look like? And it's become not an HR thing, it's become a strategy thing to really figure out what do we need at this organization and how are we going to propel ourselves, whether it's a turnaround situation, whether we're in hypergrowth, whatever that situation is. And so it's really thinking through those elements as well.
Thank you. One last question from me before I open it up to the audience. And Maggie, I'm going to address this to you if that's okay. How can candidates best prepare for a board position and build the relevant board credentials and skills?
So we've talked a lot about the skills that are needed. So I'll spend less time talking about what those skills are. But what you should think about is what your target is in terms of board service. We've talked about the differences in the different types of boards. Getting exposure to the boards that are of a similar type to what you want to do, whether it's a public company, private equity backed, family owned, an advisory board, or a nonprofit. These all have a different flavor to them. And knowing how they operate, what their role is important if you ultimately want to sit in that seat. Once you have a sense of that, and it will evolve alongside your own development of your value proposition. Start understanding what are those seats that I will fill, what is that role that I will play, where am I deeply expert, so that you can articulate that value proposition And as you begin to go out into your network and have conversations with individuals who are on boards, with individuals like us that are at the search firms, being able to not just say, I'm interested in boards, here are my qualifications, let me tell you about my career, but really tie those things together and speak the language of governance versus the language of management and operating are critically important. And so that final step is actually putting pen to paper. Write out your board bio. Start tailoring your resume to be board focused, not just management and operator focused. And in doing that, you will continue to crystallize that message and understand what additional development you might need to undertake, whether it's through further roles within your day job, adding those community board roles, adding those committee positions within your firm that broaden you out, and finding those ways to fill in the gaps that might exist.
And Lisa, if I could turn to you, for those in the audience that are interested in nonprofit boards, what advice do you have for them to prepare for those positions?
Sure. Well, just to piggyback on what Maggie said at first is, what skill set are you bringing that's additive to that organization? And typically in the board, like I mentioned before, you have an accountant, maybe a finance person, someone that helps them invest their endowment, for example. There are many ways to add value. So figuring out what that niche is for you when you enter that nonprofit board is really helpful. You'll hit the ground running and add value right away. The other thing I'd just say is building a deep knowledge of what the nonprofit actually does. I mean, it's not unlike a company. What is that nonprofit's edge in the marketplace, in a sense? There are so many nonprofits focused on various topics, right? So where does that nonprofit fit? Who are its competitors, in a sense? Who are its major donors? What's its financial position? These are all things to go in, and from a liability perspective, you kind of need to know that. How well established is the organization? Just doing your research and due diligence is important. And I think especially in the nonprofit space, it can be, maybe it's not 375 hours, but it can be a material amount of hours. And depending on the size of the nonprofit, sometimes the line jobs can fall to board members. For example, a board member could be a treasurer of an organization, present financials to the board, review audit drafts. So there's a good amount of liability and responsibility there. So you really need to make sure that you have the time and the bandwidth to be a part of it. One thing I'll tee up to to my other panel members, I'm wondering if you've seen that service on a nonprofit board helps you obtain a corporate board position. And to Leo's point about being vocal and being spurring healthy debate on a board, you can demonstrate that on a nonprofit board. That you're spurring debate, helping people think about the mission, but in doing it in a collegial way that builds a bond across the board members. But I'm curious, if people have used that path and how sort of tried and true is that?
I think it's great because, and what the Tamer Institute is doing in terms of getting people on board and board exposure early, because you have to quickly learn the difference between governance and management. So nose in, hands off, and how to operate in that environment. And then the committees that you mentioned, it's not management, and they're committees. So it could be development, it could be, and so I think it's a great way to onboard and really start to understand what that means to serve on a board.
I also find it's a great way to practice those soft skills and that influencing in that dynamic. It's important to keep the nuance in mind, though. I do see some individuals make the mistake of saying, I've sat on several nonprofit boards, therefore I am obviously ready to sit on this public company board, and understanding the differences can really make the difference in how one positions themselves to show that they understand how the governance structures and practices differ across those contexts.
I think the only thing I would say is if you've seen one board, you've seen one board. So the reality is, even if you sit on a nonprofit board, it is, some companies may see that as a proxy for understanding the role of a board, but I think if that's the reason you're doing it, then don't do it. It should be done because you have a passion for it, right? So that would be my only advice, having been on a nonprofit board that I had a lot of passion for but felt overwhelmed by the work. I think you just need to figure out what really drives you, Because again, if you've seen one board, you've seen one board, and so that's not really a proxy for, other board service.
I agree about the passion, by the way. You have to be passionate about it.
Yeah.
So at this point, we're going to thank, obviously, our panelists for their insight and perspective, but we'd love to hear what's on your mind. So I see lots of questions. I'm going to give my runners a second to go to the back and let us know your name and if you have a question directed to one panelist or elsewhere. So we can start with the gentleman who has the mic in the tie. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Osahon Akpata. I'm class of 2011. My role is CEO of Canex Creations Incorporated, which is a subsidiary of Afrexim Bank, which is a development finance institution, Pan-African. And one of the things that was said was about the amount of work it takes to be on a board, 300 to 400 hours. And I know we've just finished commencement season, and there have been lots of commencement speakers booed because they mentioned the word AI, the words artificial intelligence. But at the risk of asking a difficult question here, my question has to do with the amount of work that you have to do as a board member and the desire to leverage AI to make it easier for you to do that work when at the same time you're dealing with very sensitive information for companies that is not out in the public and now you would make it available. The question is really, are you seeing that companies have policies that say you can't put the board pack onto AI to help you summarize it and tell you what the key points are, or you can't use AI note takers in our board meetings? I'm interested to know what the views are or what you've seen. Any one of the speakers. Thank you.
I'm happy to start. So this was a topic that came up with my forum that I convened, and we had 23 directors that represented maybe just say 70 boards. And what was interesting to me, and this was we just did this meeting in January, so it's very current. What was interesting to me was they did not have the same access to AI tools as people in the organization did. And that many of the board portals that a lot of these companies use don't have sophistication around AI as an embedded component into their portals. The information is way too sensitive, particularly if it's a public company, to use any external LLM at this stage, because it's just, you are exposing the company. And so it's an interesting quandary. I think many of the portals are trying to build more and more capability there, particularly to synthesize data for the boards, but it's really not meant to be something that's used as a mechanism for judgment, right? So to Leo's point, it can synthesize information maybe a little bit, but you always have to worry about errors. And it's really about how you interpret what you're reading to know how to react to that in the boardroom. And then the last thing I would say about it is that, I think that people don't really understand how to use AI, and I think a lot of directors are investing a lot of their time to go to these director program, 12-week programs on what is AI and so forth. That is all well and good, but trust me when I tell you, no board expects that you're going to come in, if you're already an existing director, and overnight become an AI expert. That is not what you should be worried about. What you should be worried about is understanding what questions do I need to be asking to make sure that I understand what the impact of this technology is, both for me as a director in my role and for the organization. And then you figure out what the right approach is. But I would be weary about using any external provider, chat or Anthropic or anything, outside of your board portal, or whether I think it's a nonprofit or not, or whether it's a private equity fund and it's not constrained by regulatory rules or guidance. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
And I'd say it's very, it's all over the board right now. It's a bit like the Wild West. People are trying to define it and figure it out. There's one large management consulting firm, and I think they built it into people's performance metrics that they have to be spending at least 30% of their day using AI. So they're driving that. I was working on a CEO search, the chairman of the board, said, we're going to set up our own portal so that our shortlisted candidates, before they make a presentation, they have to go into this secure environment, and they're not able to download the documents because we don't want it being used to, with AI. So it's kind of all over the board.
Other questions? Go for it. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Chavi Magu. I work in climate and sustainability, focusing in e-mobility, clean transport at Amazon, and I have been on a nonprofit board for the past 5 years, focused on sustainability. My question is actually similar to Lisa's. I'm curious, in terms of transitioning from a nonprofit board to a for-profit board, what is the right kind of scale of organization to look into? What are the right kind of immediate next steps for that transition?
My one thought on that is to marry your nonprofit board experience with your day job to bring those things together to figure out what the next step is in terms of any other type of board that you might be joining. That's where I see people be the most productive. It's typically somebody who has, for example, sat on a nonprofit board in their community, and they're serving in a financial services company on the other side of the country. And by bringing those two things together, they can serve on a board that is local, serving a different corporate function, but bring in that investment expertise, for example. So it's really pretty tailored and custom. I don't know if anybody thinks anything else.
I think my reaction to the question is, you have to look in the mirror first and say, why do you think a board would be interested in you? What is it that you have that elevates it to the level of a board, a corporate board? And if you can answer that question, then think about, well, then what boards would specifically want someone like you? Do your research. See how many people like you actually serve on boards, right? Because I think it's just, I think there's the kind of desire to be on a board, and then there's the reality of what it takes to be on a board. And sometimes those things don't exactly match. So, look at yourself first, take an inside view of why you think that you should be considered for a board, and what unique capability do you think you can bring that can significantly add value that they couldn't buy as a consultant, that really has to be in the boardroom? Because this is the issue. There's only a certain amount of real estate around that table in the boardroom. So there's the whole debate about, do companies want AI skills in the boardroom? I'll tell you, based on the hundreds of conversations I've been having on this topic, they do not necessarily want an AI expert in the room unless their business is absolutely 100% reliant on where that tech is going and they're part of that ecosystem, right? Otherwise, they want people who can think broadly and know what questions to ask, because they can always hire the expertise for AI from the consulting firms. So think about it from that lens, and maybe you might think of a different answer.
And I would just say that Maggie said it earlier, but I think certainly really understanding what your value proposition is. Mm-hmm. So like Claudia said, you have to look yourself in the face and say, what value do I bring? I think a very targeted search. Okay, therefore, these are the types of things I would be interested in. I always ask people, like, when you want to do this, what's bullseye for you? I want to know, what you're targeting, what's of interest to you. I can't tell you. You need to. And so I think those two things are very important. And then I think the other element is, hey, where's the access? Mm-hmm. And most of the board roles are going to come through either a director or a CEO, or as a secondary layer, the search firms. So I'd be thinking about where's your channel? I
was just going to say that's really important. The fastest way to a board is through your own network. Let me say that again. The fastest way to a board is through your own network. So think about your network. Think about how you would position yourself within your own network, and think about where your network can take you, because that will be the fastest way for you to get on a board.
I'll just add a plug for nonprofits then, it's a great way, as you're moving towards, a greater value add on a corporate board. it's great to develop those soft skills, in a nonprofit scenario, which is maybe a little bit lower stakes and certainly usually less high vis. And then so it's a great way to build that skill set to get you down the road there if that's direction you want to head. And secondly, the networking I've found has been pretty phenomenal. I mean, many times there's very large donors on these nonprofit boards that you'll have exposure to, which really expands your network. Many of these folks, are quite accomplished in their own careers. So really getting to know those people, that shouldn't be obviously the only reason you join a nonprofit board, but it's amazing, I think, the network you can gain in the nonprofit space in the interim. That's
Other
my plug.
questions in the audience? Who has
Hi,
a,
good
okay, yes, in the
afternoon.
back.
Joanne Yu, class of 2006. I'm a private equity investor. I would love some honest insight from a large listed board perspective in this country, if you guys think that boards are becoming less diverse within this political climate, and what you're seeing from your client mandates and shortlists. I was really disappointed when I saw that Goldman dropped their pre-IPO diverse requirement, and it's just very discouraging, but would love to hear what you think on the large corporate side, what you're seeing there.
I would say that we've institutionalized the process of making sure diversity is included in every search. So that has been institutionalized into our process. But what I'll also say is it's plateaued. And so you're seeing less recently for those reasons.
Yeah, and so what I've seen is if a board is going to lose a diverse member, they really do try to replace that person with a diverse member. So it's not as though they're saying, well, now that it's not a requirement anymore, I don't care, right? So that's the good news. The bad news they're not looking to expand, except for, and this is just my own experience, where you have a female CEO, the boards tend to be more diverse, just point blank. But like I said, while I don't think those numbers are dramatically coming down because people are trying to keep the status quo, I don't think that they're getting many new board seats going to diversity candidates.
To that point, I noticed that the boards that were committed to diversity continue to be committed to diversity. Those that were placating external stakeholders have gone back to their old ways, but there are plenty that have made the transition and have gone further along and have more of a commitment now than they did before, and thus the commitment's still there, the language has perhaps changed.
Yeah.
They may have dropped that requirement, but it's still important to them. They may not be asking us for this person must be a woman or a person of color the way they might have 4 years ago, but they're still expecting that slate to be diverse, and they're still expecting that their composition over the next 5 years will not become less diverse.
And we talked about this with the head of governance for State Street and with someone who is at Glass Lewis. And what because we kind of beat up the guy from State Street saying, how come you took this out of your voting requirements? And he said, it may not say it exactly to your point, specifically in that way that we're going to take this into consideration, but we are. So the institutional investors are still seeing the benefit of diversity. They've downplayed the language, but not necessarily changed their stance.
I don't think I'll say on that, sorry. But it really is up to each person as well. And so why is it relevant? What unique perspective do you bring to the boardroom because of the diversity? And so I would have that really dialed in. I've had several great boards that I've done some work with, and they said, we want a Latino, and here's why. Most of our end markets are focused on that demographic. If you look at the purchasing power of the U.S., of Hispanics, they would be the 5th largest GDP in the world. Things are moving that way, and so if we're true capitalists and we want to grow our business, then we need somebody that brings that perspective. And I've called people that then might fit that spec, and some are passionate about it and say, absolutely, and let me tell you how and why. Others will say, I don't even identify that way. And so it's not going to be relevant to what they're solving for. So it's really incumbent on each person to really think about, well, why does it matter, and what do you bring to the table because of it?
That's the
Hi.
question.
Thanks very much. Anthony Phillip, class of 2016. I co-manage 2 portfolios that tend to be management friendly. My question is, if one were added to a board as part of an activist slate, does that then block you or mark you in some way negatively for future roles, even a decade or so into the future? Thanks.
I think it depends on how that structure is. I mean, there was more of a stigma in the past, frankly, around that than there is now. I think that most people who have, most companies as well as individuals who serve, once they're on the board, they're on the board. They're not an activist any longer. They're there for one purpose, to help that company, to make sure that that company is doing what it needs to do to add shareholder value. So there's less of a stigma. I think, I think where it comes up as more of a negative if it's a really ugly situation and very public. But again, it's less, once that's passed, it's less of a, okay, this person is friends with an activist. It doesn't really work like that. Many times activists will put someone forward and that person doesn't even know that they were on that slate, right? Until after the fact. That just happened in a situation I'm working with. There were an activist put himself forward and then put 2 other people forward. It was very public. And when we talked to those 2 potential candidates, because the board wanted to understand, okay, who are these people? Neither of them had met the activist. That this was just profiles that they put forward. They were happy to get the call. They were happy to, he had one conversation with them that did not necessarily mean that they were going to be part of a proxy fight. It never went to that. But I think that this whole stigma around activists and being part of a dissident slate is not as big as it once was.
Comes back to those boardroom behaviors and that independence that we've talked about before. I've got a longtime client who we were just talking with them last week. They said these 2 guys came on 10 years ago from an activist, and we were very concerned. And now they're our best directors. They are the most productive. They create the most collaboration in the room. They are our highest performing board members. And then in other contexts, it's this person came in and they can't work with anybody. They're disruptive in a bad way. And so it comes back to that, how are you acting once you're there?
And the difference is the independent versus the activists themselves, right? The activists themselves, no one wants that. But the independents, yeah.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I want to give some people up front the opportunity.
Hello, my name is Asmao Ahmed. I am back here for my 20th. And Claudia, I'm going to disagree with something you said respectfully. So we have a quick introduction. I'm an engineer by training, and I've spent time building AI products at frontier tech companies. I've also spent some time applying AI at regulated companies. I sit on a number of boards, public company boards here in the US and in Asia. And I do think that it is a mistake for board members not to be fluent in AI today.
Not to be what?
It is a mistake for board members not to be fluent
Yeah.
in AI
Yeah,
today.
right. Correct.
We cannot separate AI from the business,
Right.
increasingly more so. And as board members with a fiduciary duty to manage the business of the company, understanding AI risk is critically important.
Yeah.
And I cannot share how many times I have been called upon to opine on a company's AI risk posture. Enough times that I actually recently built an AI certification training program called PACT, which I'd love to talk to you more about, for board members to become AI fluent. I sit on the audit committees of these companies, and I'm finding that we're moving in the same direction with data and AI as we have established with, financial due diligence. So I do think that's increasingly important. And if I were advising this audience, I would say get really cognizant on AI, at least on a governance level. I spent some time in DC this past week on AI governance and what this current administration is thinking about in terms of governance at various parts of the company, including at the board. So my question to you is this. Do you think that there is going to be an opportunity? I've been an advocate for this for a long time. Just like we have audit committees and risk committee members, risk committees that are mandated for public companies. Do you think there's ever going to be one around the technology committee now that technology and business are almost inseparable?
That's a great question. And just to be clear, I 100% agree with you on AI fluency. But I want to differentiate fluency from expertise because, again, I think I'm just telling you based on conversations with clients that are not tech companies, because as I said when I came in, I'm no expert in tech, right? But the companies that are not tech companies are not necessarily looking for their board to be tech experts, nor are they necessarily expecting to bring on a tech expert. Fluency is a completely different story, and even we have a development program for AI fluency for the boardroom. So I 100% agree with you on that. So just to clear any misunderstanding, that is 100% the correct way to think about it. In terms of the tech committee, I was sure, what was it, 3-4 years ago, that tech committees were going to be a rising trend because of cyber. I was sure that that was going to happen. And I think it started, and then it got kind of, I think boards started to say, you know what, this is not something we want to relegate to a committee. We really think it is a boardroom issue. And so yes, a lot of times it sits in audit because audit touches every part of the organization and it kind of makes sense. But I do think that technology as a business model issue, and risk, as a competitive issue, as the future revenue stream based on the way businesses are going to have to transform, are becoming boardroom issues, and therefore I've not seen much of a growth in the tech committees.
And further, I 100% agree.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it, and things can change. Maybe there is a tech committee at some point, but right now, what I'm hearing from clients is, it's not the technical competency of AI that we want. We want the strategic literacy. We want the strategic fluency, as you put it, and in every role. So whether it's the chair of the audit, chair of NomGov, chair of comp, the chair of the board, it's incumbent on each person to have that literacy.
So thank you all for this wonderful session. We are at 1:45, so I want to thank all the audience members for joining us today. And if I could ask you all to raise your hands and thank our panelists for their insight and perspective, to Maggie, Leo, Claudia, and Lisa.